Heidegger, of course, selects, quote, man himself as his point of departure, because each Dasein, a being there or existence, is a special kind of entity. It is a being distinguished by the fact, as Heidegger says, that in its very being, that being is an issue for it. So it's a uniquely well-situated informant, and so Dasein is to be interrogated in the question of its being. Dasein's reflexive relationship with its own being first recommends it for attention, but the fundamental structure, the overall how of a Dasein's being is being in the world, and being in the world stands for a unitary phenomenon which can't be disaggregated into two or more wholly separate structures or entities, meaning that, according to Heidegger, there can be no characterization of the being, correct characterization of the being of a Dasein, which is not also a correct characterization of the being, the how it bees, of at least some aspects of the rest of the world. I'm also cannibalizing the English language, like Greg, in trying to explain what Heidegger says. Okay, Heidegger, of course, believes that the great error of phenomenologists before him was to take for granted the primacy of a detached, spectatorial, ratiocinative state of a Dasein, states for which the rest of the world figure merely as objects of contemplation and cogitation. And so, for example, in Edmund Husserl, he criticizes that. For Heidegger, being in the world is always and primarily a practical, purposive way of being. A Dasein is fundamentally an interested, committed being, a being constantly in the middle of tasks and projects, in which the rest of the world figures not merely as objects of contemplation and theorization, but fundamentally as equipment. Heidegger doesn't deny the possibility of the detached contemplative stance, but he does think that it's a secondary derivative mode of being in the world. He tries to persuade his reader of this using the phenomenological method. Is it not, asks Heidegger, above all at moments when equipment in the broadest sense fails to function, when it breaks down, and we, the users, are stunned, baffled as to how we're going to proceed, that equipment becomes, as he puts it, conspicuous. That what a moment before was ready-to-hand equipment suddenly becomes pure presence at hand which cannot be used and just lies there. And it's not the knowing the world theoretically, which other phenomenologists have talked about, identical with precisely this deficient mode of concern, the helpless way in which we stand before something unready to hand, which stands in the way of our concern. So, detached contemplation of a present-at-hand object is a derivative manner of being in the world. It is a deficient manner of engagement. Based on his phenomenological analysis of being in the world, which he has identified as Dasein's fundamental structure, Heidegger concludes that the being of Dasein is care, where care or concern is meant in a technical sense, a catch-all which covers such ways of being in as having to do with something, producing something, attending to something, looking after it, and much more. Okay, so whether or not we're convinced by these arguments by Heidegger, or Heidegger's train of thought, let's say, as regards Dasein's being in the world, it's important for our purposes, for my purposes now, to appreciate on what theoretical plane he believes that his findings are located. So Heidegger makes clear that he believes them to be ontological findings, rather than the kind of empirical findings about humans and their environment, which anthropology, psychology, biology might present us with. Those disciplines, on the basis of a posteriori observation, put forward what he calls ontic hypotheses about present-at-hand objects, their properties, and of course causal connections between them. Heidegger's fundamental ontology, by contrast, makes findings about the being, the how they be, as it were, of beings, which are to be confirmed not by empirical observation, but on an a priori basis, which he's explicit about. The existential analytic of Dasein comes before any psychology or anthropology, writes Heidegger, certainly before any biology. Of course, Heidegger doesn't write off contingent facts about human beings as insignificant. On the contrary, Heidegger acknowledges that the being of a Dasein is such that it is bound up in its destiny with the being of those entities which it encounters. And the presence and the impact of contingent facts and events is what Heidegger calls a Dasein's facticity. But Heidegger insists his existential analytic has established that whatever a particular Dasein's unique facticity may be, its being will exhibit certain essential structures, or basic existential states. So, for example, any given Dasein's fundamental structure is being in the world, Care is the basic state of a Dasein. A Dasein can't outstrip the possibility of death. Anxiety in the face of death is a basic state of mind in Dasein. Every Dasein is afflicted by the temptation to cover up one's own most being towards death. Every Dasein will sometimes resort to a fleeing in the face of one's own most being towards death, a falling into the tranquilized everydayness of the world of his concern, encouraged by the idle talk of the day, which Honorato talked about earlier today. But unavoidably, from time to time, conscience summons Dasein's self from its lostness in the day, summons it with its uncanniness from an inauthentic being towards death to an authentic being towards death, a being towards this possibility without either fleeing it or covering it up. A Dasein is essentially something which can be authentic. It can, in its very being, choose itself and win itself, but it can also lose itself. Facticity enters into every aspect of a Dasein's being, colouring or inflecting the manner in which each of the essential structures I've described, or basic states, makes its appearance. Ontological anxiety in the face of death will manifest on the ontic plane differently for different Daseins, depending on their psychological makeup. Daseins born into different societies will find themselves with different social roles, different life goals, different relationship templates to fall into when they flee or cover up their mortality. And of course, the tranquilizing talk of the they will vary from place to place. And conscience's ontological call is going to be variably inflected on the ontic plane, depending on the religious, philosophical, or spiritual points of reference with which a Dasein's socialization has kitted it out. But variably coloured or inflected though they may be, being in the world, care, facticity, anxiety, idle talk, falling, conscience's call, and the choice between authenticity and inauthenticity are structures essential to Dasein's constitution for Heidegger. They're not just any accidental structures, he writes, but essential ones, which in every kind of being that factical Dasein may possess, persist as determinative for the character of its being. So each of these aspects of the being, the how it bees, of a Dasein has a share in conditioning the possibility of any existence whatsoever. So as conditions of possibility of any particular human existence, these fundamental structures of any given Dasein's being are, as it were, like cake molds, guaranteeing continuity of overall ontological form, whatever contingent ingredients may be their ontical contents. In sum, fundamental ontology studies not which entities there are and what properties they have, but which ways of being of entities there are, and what fundamental structures those ways of being have. It pays special attention to Dasein, the being of each of us human persons, because any given Dasein's fundamental structure of being in the world is a unitary phenomenon comprising both the Dasein's way of being and the rest of the world's way of being. Whereas fields of study concerned with the ontical plane discover contingent facts about entities through empirical observation, fundamental ontology makes a priori findings about the essential structural features of ways of beings of entities. Since, as Maldonado Torres notes, fundamental ontology is located within the phenomenological tradition, its practitioners do invite their readers to attend to their experience, but that's not with the aim of drawing a posteriori conclusions from observable regularities. Rather, it's with the aim of inviting the reader to note, for themselves, constitutive conditions on the possibility of aspects of their lived experience or Erlebnis, features which are essential to the structure of any Dasein's being.